wind tore through the trees like something alive, and Alira could no longer feel her fingers. She pressed the small wooden box tighter against her chest, her knuckles white beneath her torn gloves, and forced her legs forward through snow that reached above her knees. Somewhere behind her, wolves were howling. Somewhere ahead of her, if the old maps were right, stood the gates of a kingdom that did not know she existed yet. 3 days ago, her grandmother had pulled her close in a small cottage that smelled of dying embers, and pressed this box into her hands. The old woman's fingers had trembled, not from cold, but from something else. Fear, maybe, or relief. "Take this to King Roderick," her grandmother had whispered, "before the first full moon of winter. Do not let anyone else touch it. Do not open it yourself. And Alira, listen to me carefully. If anyone asks what is inside, you tell them you do not know." "But I don't know," Alira had said. Her grandmother had smiled then, a tired, sad smile that Alira still could not stop thinking about. "Good. Then you will not have to lie." Those had been her final clear words. By morning, her grandmother's breathing had slowed to almost nothing, and by the time the sun rose fully over the frost-covered hills, she was gone. Alira had buried her beneath the old oak tree behind their home, her hands raw from digging through half-frozen earth, and then she had wrapped herself in every piece of clothing she owned and started walking. That had been 3 days ago. Now, standing in the heart of a forest she did not recognize, with the sun sinking fast behind gray clouds, Alira was beginning to understand just how impossible her grandmother's request had been. The village elders had warned her not to go. The road to the capital crossed the Ashvane Woods, a stretch of forest known for two things: brutal winter storms that could bury a grown man standing still, and the king's wolves, enormous gray and black beasts that were said to serve no master but Roderick Ashvane himself. No ordinary person walked those woods and came out the other side. But Alira was not an ordinary person anymore. She was a girl, carrying her grandmother's final wish, and she intended to keep it. She stumbled over a buried root and caught herself against a tree, gasping. The cold had a way of making her thoughts slow and heavy, like wading through syrup. She knew this was dangerous. She had heard the stories, the ones about travelers who sat down in the snow just to rest for a moment and never stood up again. She forced herself to keep moving. One foot after another, the box clutched beneath her cloak like a small, stubborn heartbeat. It was almost dark when she heard the first growl. It was low, deep, and close. Too close. Alira froze mid-step, her breath catching in her throat. She turned slowly, scanning the shadows between the trees, and that was when she saw it. A wolf. Not just any wolf, but one larger than any animal she had ever seen in her life, its fur black as the space between stars, its eyes a pale, unsettling gold that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. It stood perfectly still at the edge of a small clearing, watching her. Alira's heart pounded so hard she was certain the wolf could hear it. She had heard the old stories about the king's wolves, how they were said to be more than beasts, how they could sense things ordinary animals could not. Looking into those golden eyes now, she believed every word of it. She did not run. She had been told once by an old hunter that running from a wolf was the worst thing a person could do. So instead, she stood as still as she could manage, her whole body trembling from cold and fear in equal measure, and waited. The wolf took one slow step toward her. Then another. Alira's mind raced through everything she had ever heard about wild animals, but nothing prepared her for what happened next. The wolf stopped an arm's length away, lowered its great head, and sniffed at the edge of her cloak, right where the box was hidden. Alira held her breath. She expected teeth. She expected pain. Instead, the wolf simply looked up at her face, tilted its head slightly, as if studying her, and then, without any warning at all, turned and disappeared silently into the trees. For a long moment, Alira could not move. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else. When she finally forced herself to breathe again, the sound came out as something between a sob and a laugh. She did not know it then, but that wolf was no ordinary creature of the forest. It was Ash, bonded companion to King Roderick Ashvane himself, a beast whose instincts had never once been wrong in all the years it had walked at the king's side. And in that clearing, staring at a frozen, exhausted girl with a wooden box clutched to her chest, something in Ash had already decided that this girl was not a threat. The king himself had not yet made up his mind about anything. He did not even know she existed. Illyra did not have the luxury of understanding any of this. All she knew was that she was still alive, the box was still safely hidden beneath her cloak, and the sky above her was rapidly losing what little light remained. She pushed forward, faster now, driven by a strange mixture of fear and something close to hope. If a wolf that fierce had chosen not to hurt her, perhaps the universe was not entirely against her tonight. The forest seemed to stretch on forever. Every shadow looked the same as the last. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper carrying secrets she could not understand. Illyra's thoughts drifted, unbidden, back to her grandmother, to the years they had spent together in that small cottage at the edge of the village. Her grandmother had never spoken much about her past. She had arrived in their village decades ago, a stranger with no family and no history that anyone could trace, and she had built a quiet life as a healer, tending to the sick and the injured with a skill that seemed almost unnatural. Illyra had always assumed her grandmother's secrecy was simply the nature of an old woman who preferred solitude. Now, walking through a forest that might very well kill her, she began to wonder if there had been more to the story. Why else would a woman on her deathbed insist, with her final breaths, that a sealed box reach the king himself? The trees finally began to thin as the last of the daylight faded completely. Illyra could see lights in the distance, small and flickering, growing steadily larger and more numerous the further she walked. Her heart lifted with a fragile kind of hope. She was close. She had to be close. By the time she stumbled out of the tree line, her legs were shaking so badly she could barely stand. Before her stretched a wide, snow-covered field, and beyond that, rising against the darkening sky, like something out of a dream, stood the walls of the capital city, and further still, the towers of the royal palace itself, lit with warm golden light that seemed impossibly far away. She had made it. Somehow, against every warning she had been given, she had crossed the Ashvane woods and survived. But surviving the forest, she would soon learn, was only the beginning of her troubles. The walk across the open field felt longer than the entire journey through the woods combined. The wind here was even more brutal, with nothing to block its path, and Illyra found herself leaning forward against it with every step, using the last reserves of strength she had left. Her feet had gone completely numb inside her worn boots. She was fairly certain she had lost feeling in her toes hours ago. She thought about her grandmother's words again and again, turning them over like stones in her mind. Do not let anyone else touch it. Do not open it yourself. If anyone asks what is inside, tell them you do not know. There had been an urgency in her grandmother's voice that Illyra had never heard before, not once in all her years growing up in that quiet cottage. Whatever was in that box, her grandmother had believed it mattered enough to spend her final hours making sure it reached the right hands. Illyra could not begin to imagine what could possibly be so important. She had not dared to open it herself, despite the temptation gnawing at her during every hour of her journey. She had promised, and even now, freezing and exhausted and unsure if she would even survive long enough to reach the palace gates, she intended to keep that promise. As she drew closer to the city walls, she began to notice details she had missed from a distance. Guards patrolled the ramparts, their spears catching flickers of torchlight, banners bearing the crest of House Ashvane, a wolf's head circled by silver stars, snapped in the harsh wind above the main gate. The city itself seemed to hum with a quiet, watchful energy, as if it knew a storm was coming, though Illyra could not tell whether that storm was the weather or something else entirely. She approached the main gate slowly, her legs trembling with every step, and two guards stationed there turned to look at her with expressions of open suspicion. She could hardly blame them. She must have looked like a ghost, pale and frostbitten, her clothes crusted with snow and ice, stumbling toward them out of a forest that swallowed most travelers whole. "Halt!" one of the guards called out, stepping forward with his spear lowered slightly. He was a broad man, with a thick beard streaked gray, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. "State your business. No one crosses those woods this time of year without good reason, and fewer still survive it." Illyra opened her mouth to answer, but her throat was so dry and raw from the cold that no sound came out at first. She swallowed hard and tried again. "I need to see the king," she managed, her voice barely more than a rasp. "I have something for him. Something important." The second guard, younger and clearly more skeptical, let out a short laugh that held no real humor in it. Everyone who shows up at these gates claims to have something important for the king. Half of them want money, the other half want favors, and none of them ever actually get past this gate. What makes you any different, girl? Alira's hand tightened instinctively around the box hidden beneath her cloak. I'm not asking for anything, she said, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the exhaustion pulling at every part of her body. I only need to deliver this. It was my grandmother's final wish. Please. I've walked for 3 days to get here. The older guard studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Alira could see the doubt in his eyes, the practiced suspicion of a man who had turned away countless desperate travelers before her. She braced herself for rejection, wondering with a rising sense of panic what she would do if they simply refused to let her through. She had no strength left to argue, no clever words to convince them, nothing but the truth, and a box she could not even explain. Before either guard could respond, a low growl rumbled from somewhere in the shadows beyond the gate, and both men stiffened immediately, their expressions shifting from suspicion to something closer to alarm. Alira turned to see the same black wolf from the forest padding silently out of the darkness, its golden eyes fixed directly on her. The guards took an instinctive step backward, lowering their spears in a gesture that looked almost like reverence. That's Ash, the younger guard said quietly, his voice tight with something between fear and confusion. The king's own wolf. What is it doing all the way out here? The older guard's eyes moved between Alira and the wolf, his suspicion transforming slowly into something far more cautious. Ash never leaves the palace grounds without reason, he murmured, almost to himself, and it never approaches strangers. The wolf walked forward and settled itself directly beside Alira, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from its massive body, a small mercy against the biting cold. It sat there calmly, golden eyes fixed on the two guards, as if daring them to refuse her entry. The younger guard swallowed visibly and looked at his companion. What do we do? The older guard hesitated only a moment longer before letting out a long breath that fogged in the cold air. We let her through, he said finally. And we send word ahead. If Ash has taken an interest in this girl, the king will want to know immediately. The heavy gate groaned open, and Alira stepped through it on legs that felt like they might give out at any moment, the wolf walking silently at her side, like some strange and unexpected guardian. She had no way of knowing what waited for her beyond those walls, no way of understanding why this fierce, unpredictable creature had chosen to protect her, not once, but twice now. All she knew was that she had made it inside, that the box was still safe beneath her cloak, and that somewhere in the towers ahead, a king who did not yet know her name was about to receive a visitor he had never expected, delivered to his very doorstep by his own bonded wolf. Whatever happened next, Alira understood one thing, with absolute certainty. Her grandmother's final wish was about to collide, quite literally, with the will of a king, known throughout the realm for his cold judgment and his deep, abiding mistrust of strangers. She only hoped that whatever was inside that small wooden box would be worth everything it had already cost her to bring it this far. Inside the walls of the capital, the air felt different. Warmer, though only slightly, and thick with the smell of wood smoke and roasting food drifting from distant kitchens. Alira barely noticed any of it. Every part of her body ached with a bone-deep exhaustion that made the bright torches lining the streets blur together into streaks of orange light. The younger guard had run ahead to alert the palace, and by the time Alira reached the outer courtyard, a small group of stewards and soldiers had already gathered, watching her approach with a mixture of curiosity and open unease. Ash walked beside her the entire way, its massive paws silent against the cobblestones, and every person they passed seemed to give the wolf a wide, respectful berth. A woman stepped forward from the group, dressed in fine dark robes that marked her as someone of importance within the palace household. She had sharp eyes and silver-streaked hair pulled back in a tight braid, and she studied Alira with the kind of careful attention that made Alira suddenly conscious of how disheveled she must look. I am Garrick's assistant, the woman said, though something about the way she carried herself suggested she was far more than a simple assistant. You may call me Wren. I understand you claim to have something for the king. Yes, Alira said, her voice hoarse. Please, I've come a long way. Wren's gaze flicked briefly toward Ash, and something like surprise crossed her features before she carefully smoothed it away. So I see. Very well. Follow me. Try to keep pace if you can manage it. His Majesty does not enjoy being kept waiting, and word of your arrival has already reached him. Elira forced her tired legs to move faster, following Ren through a maze of corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The palace was unlike anything she had ever seen in her life. Tall stone archways rose above her, decorated with intricate carvings of wolves and mountains and stars. Tapestries, depicting old battles and older alliances, hung along the walls, their colors rich and deep despite what must have been decades of age. Everywhere she looked, there was some new detail to catch her eye, though her exhaustion made it difficult to fully appreciate any of it. Ash padded along beside her the entire way, drawing nervous glances from every servant and guard they passed. Elira found herself grateful for its presence, strange as that thought was. She had walked into this palace, utterly alone, without a single person who knew her name or her purpose, and yet this fierce, unpredictable creature had chosen, for reasons she could not begin to understand, to stay close to her side. They eventually arrived at a set of tall wooden doors, reinforced with iron, and carved with the same wolf and star crest she had seen on the banners outside the city gates. 2 guards flanked the entrance, and beyond it, Elira could hear the low murmur of voices. "The receiving hall," Ren said quietly. "His Majesty is finishing another matter. You will wait here until you are called." Elira nodded, grateful for even a moment to catch her breath. She sank onto a wooden bench along the corridor wall, and Ash settled itself at her feet without hesitation, resting its great head on its paws as though this were the most natural thing in the world. She did not have to wait long. Within minutes, the tall doors swung open, and a steward gestured for her to enter. Elira rose on unsteady legs, tightened her grip on the box beneath her cloak, and stepped forward into the receiving hall. The room was vast, with a high vaulted ceiling and tall windows that let in the pale light of the rising moon. A long carpet stretched from the entrance to a raised platform at the far end, where a throne carved from dark wood sat beneath a massive tapestry, depicting a wolf standing atop a mountain peak. And there, seated on that throne, with an expression that gave away absolutely nothing, was King Roderick Ashvane. Elira had heard stories about the king during her journey, whispered by travelers at roadside inns, and told in hushed, careful tones by villagers who feared he might somehow hear them speaking his name. He was known throughout the realm as a ruler who trusted almost no one, a man who had survived an assassination attempt against his father years ago, and had grown into his crown wrapped in layers of suspicion and cold, calculated caution. Looking at him now, Elira understood immediately why those stories had taken root. He was younger than she expected, though his eyes carried a weariness that made him seem far older than his years. He wore simple, dark clothing, rather than the elaborate robes she had imagined, and his gaze, when it settled on her, was sharp and assessing, missing nothing. "Approach," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying easily across the vast hall. Elira walked forward, her legs trembling with exhaustion and nerves in equal measure. She stopped a respectful distance from the throne, and dipped into what she hoped was an acceptable bow, though her body was so tired she nearly lost her balance in the process. "Your Majesty," she managed. "My name is Elira. I've come from the village of Hollow Creek, near the northern border." "I am aware of where Hollow Creek is," Roderick said. His eyes flicked briefly toward Ash, who had settled itself protectively at Elira's side, and something unreadable passed across his expression. "What I am not aware of is why my wolf has taken such an unusual interest in a stranger who has crossed my woods uninvited." Elira swallowed hard. "I don't know why, Your Majesty. I only know that it did not harm me, and it led the guards to let me through the gate." "Ash does not simply take an interest in people," Roderick said, his tone carrying a sharpness that made Elira's stomach tighten with anxiety. "It has walked at my side since it was a pup. It does not trust easily, and it certainly does not escort strangers into my palace without reason. So I will ask you plainly, what business do you have here that would explain such a thing?" Elira reached beneath her cloak with trembling hands, and withdrew the small wooden box, holding it out before her. "My grandmother asked me to bring this to you before she died, Your Majesty. She said it needed to reach you before the first full moon of winter. She did not tell me why. She only told me it was important, and that I should trust no one else with it." Roderick's expression shifted for the briefest moment, something flickering behind his eyes that might have been curiosity, or might have been suspicion deepening further. He rose slowly from his throne and descended the steps of the platform, approaching her with slow, deliberate steps that made her heart pound harder with every one. "A sealed box," he said, stopping a few paces away and studying it with narrowed eyes. "Delivered by a stranger, escorted by my own wolf, with instructions from a woman who is now conveniently dead and cannot be questioned. Forgive me if I find the timing of this rather suspicious." "I understand how it must look," Alira said quickly, "but I swear to you, I don't know what's inside. I never opened it. I only did what my grandmother asked." "And why should I believe that?" Roderick's voice had gone cold, dangerously quiet. "I have enemies, girl. More than you could possibly imagine. Men and women who would use any means available to reach me, including sending innocent-looking travelers carrying boxes that might contain poison, or worse." "You expect me to simply trust your word?" Alira felt panic rising in her chest, but she forced herself to stand firm. "I walked through the Ashvane woods alone, Your Majesty. I nearly died doing it. If I meant you harm, would I have risked my own life to deliver it? Would your own wolf have protected me the entire way if I carried something meant to hurt you?" Something in her words seemed to give Roderick pause, though his expression remained guarded. He studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment, his gaze moving between her face and the box she still held out before her. "Perhaps," he said finally, "or perhaps you are simply an unwitting messenger, used by someone far more dangerous than yourself. Either way, I cannot allow an unverified object into my presence without caution." He turned toward the guards stationed near the hall's entrance. "Take the box. Have it examined thoroughly before it comes anywhere near me, and take the girl to the West Tower. She will remain there until I decide what to do with her." 2 guards stepped forward immediately, and Alira felt her chest tighten with fear. "Please," she said, her voice cracking with desperation. "I've done nothing wrong. I only wanted to honor my grandmother's wish." "That may well be true," Roderick said, his tone carrying no real sympathy despite his words. "But I did not build a lasting kingdom by taking chances with things I do not understand. You will remain under guard until I am satisfied that neither you nor this box present any danger to my household." The guards moved to take hold of her arms, and Alira felt a fresh wave of exhaustion and helplessness threatened to overwhelm her entirely. She had walked for 3 days through brutal cold, survived a forest known for swallowing travelers whole, and now, finally standing before the very man her grandmother had sent her to find, she was being treated like a criminal. She opened her mouth to protest again, though she had no idea what more she could possibly say to change his mind. Before she could speak, a low, warning growl rumbled through the hall, deep and unmistakable, silencing every conversation and freezing every guard mid-motion. Ash rose from where it had been sitting calmly at Alira's side, its hackles raised, its golden eyes fixed directly on the guards reaching for her. It stepped forward, placing itself firmly between Alira and the men attempting to take hold of her, and let out another low growl that echoed ominously through the vast stone hall. The guards froze, exchanging uncertain glances, clearly unwilling to test the wolf's patience further. Even Roderick himself, seated comfortably on thrones that commanded the fear and respect of an entire kingdom, went utterly still, his eyes widening slightly, as he watched his own bonded companion defy him openly, for what appeared to be the very first time in its life. "Ash," Roderick said slowly, his voice carrying a note of genuine confusion beneath its usual command. "Stand down." The wolf did not move. It remained exactly where it was, positioned protectively in front of Alira, its golden eyes locked on the king with an intensity that made even the guards take an unconscious step backward. For the first time since Alira had entered the receiving hall, King Roderick Ashvane looked, for just a moment, genuinely uncertain. The silence in the hall stretched long enough that Alira could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. No one moved, no one seemed to breathe. Every guard, every steward, every servant, standing along the edges of the receiving hall, watched the standoff between their king and his own bonded wolf, with expressions caught somewhere between disbelief and quiet alarm. Roderick took a slow step forward, his jaw tight, his eyes never leaving the wolf that stood so firmly between him and the trembling girl behind it. "Ash," he said again, quieter this time, though there was an edge beneath the calm. "I gave you an order." The wolf did not budge. If anything, its posture grew more resolute, its golden eyes narrowing slightly as it held the king's gaze, without a hint of the submission every other creature in that hall seemed to instinctively offer him. An older man standing near the throne, dressed in deep blue robes that marked him as some kind of advisor, stepped forward cautiously. He had a weathered face and kind, sharp eyes that studied the scene with far more thoughtfulness than alarm. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "in all the years Ash has served at your side, has it ever once disobeyed you?" Roderick's jaw tightened further, though he did not look away from the wolf. "No," he admitted, the word coming out reluctantly. "Never." "Then perhaps," the advisor continued, his voice measured and calm, "this is worth more consideration than a simple order to stand down." Roderick finally tore his gaze from Ash and turned it toward his advisor, a flicker of frustration crossing his features. "Garrick, this is not the time for philosophy. I have a stranger in my hall carrying an unverified object, and my own wolf is behaving as though I am the one posing the threat." "With respect, Your Majesty," Garrick said, "Ash has spent its entire life reading danger before any of us could see it coming. It warned you of the poisoned wine 3 winters ago, before your taster had even taken a sip. It sensed the assassin hiding in the eastern garden before your own guards noticed him. I would think carefully before dismissing its instincts now, simply because they are inconvenient." The hall remained tensely silent as Roderick considered this, his eyes flicking back toward Alira, who stood frozen behind Ash's protective stance, too exhausted and frightened to fully process what was happening around her. She could see the internal struggle playing out across the king's face, the collision between years of hardened caution and an instinct he had apparently learned, through long experience, not to ignore. Finally, Roderick exhaled slowly and raised a hand, gesturing for the guards to step back. They obeyed immediately, retreating several paces, clearly relieved to be released from whatever tension had gripped the room. "Very well," Roderick said, though his voice carried no real warmth. "The girl will not go to the dungeons tonight, but she will remain under guard in the West Tower, and the box will be examined thoroughly before it comes anywhere near me. Is that satisfactory to you, Ash?" The wolf, remarkably, seemed to relax slightly at this, its hackles lowering as it took a step back from its position in front of Alira, though it remained close beside her, as if unwilling to let her out of its sight entirely. Alira let out a shaky breath she had not realized she was holding, relief flooding through her exhausted body, even as new questions crowded her mind. Whatever was inside that box, whatever her grandmother had known that she herself did not, it seemed to matter enough for even a wild, unpredictable wolf to defy the will of a king to protect it. Garrick approached her gently, his expression far kinder than anything else she had encountered since arriving at the palace. "Come with me, child," he said. "You look as though you might collapse where you stand, and that would solve none of our problems tonight." Alira nodded gratefully, casting one final glance toward the king, who remained standing near his throne, watching her with an expression she could not fully read. There was suspicion there still, she could see that clearly, but something else had crept into his gaze as well, something that looked almost like uncertainty. Ash followed closely as Garrick led her from the receiving hall, through another maze of corridors that felt slightly warmer and less imposing than the grand halls she had passed through earlier. They eventually arrived at a modest but comfortable room within the West Tower, furnished with a simple bed, a small hearth, already crackling with warm fire, and a single window that looked out over the snow-covered city below. "You will be safe here tonight," Garrick said, gesturing for 2 guards stationed nearby, to take up positions outside the door. "I know this is not the welcome you hoped for, but I promise you, His Majesty is not a cruel man, whatever the stories claim. He is careful, and after everything this kingdom has endured, I cannot say I blame him for that caution." "What happened to him?" Alira asked before she could stop herself, curiosity overriding her exhaustion for just a moment. "The stories I heard on my way here, they spoke of an attempt on his life." Garrick's expression grew somber, and he was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Not his life," he said finally, "his father's. King Aldrich was nearly killed within these very walls when Roderick was still a young man, poisoned by someone close enough to the royal household to slip past every guard and every precaution we had in place. We never found who was truly responsible. The man we captured and punished was, we later suspected, only a pawn for someone with far greater reach. That uncertainty has haunted this palace for years, and it changed Roderick more than I think he even realizes. Illyra absorbed this information slowly, her mind, despite its exhaustion, beginning to piece together fragments of a larger picture she did not yet fully understand. Her grandmother had never spoken of any connection to the royal family, had never even mentioned the kingdom of Ashvane beyond passing references in old stories told by firelight. And yet here she was, delivering a box that had somehow compelled the king's own wolf to defy him, in a palace still carrying the wounds of an unsolved betrayal from decades past. "Rest now," Garrick said gently, noticing the exhaustion clearly written across her face. "Whatever answers that box holds, they will still be there in the morning. You have earned a night of peace, after everything you endured to get here." He left her then, closing the door softly behind him, though Illyra could hear the guards settling into position just beyond it. Ash, to her surprise, remained inside the room, curling up near the hearth with a contented sigh, as though it had decided, without any need for permission, that this was exactly where it intended to stay. Illyra sank onto the edge of the bed, her body finally allowing itself to feel the full weight of everything she had endured. 3 days of walking through brutal cold. A wolf that should have killed her but instead had chosen, twice now, to protect her. A king who had nearly had her dragged away, only to be stopped by his own bonded companion, in an act that had left the entire hall stunned into silence. She thought of her grandmother again, of those final trembling words spoken in a cottage that already smelled of an ending. "Take this to the king. Do not let anyone else touch it." Whatever secrets that small wooden box contained, Illyra was beginning to suspect they ran far deeper than she had ever imagined, deeper perhaps than even her grandmother had fully explained. She glanced toward Ash, who lay curled peacefully by the fire, its golden eyes half closed but still, somehow, watchful. "Why did you help me?" she whispered into the quiet room, not really expecting an answer. The wolf's ear twitched at the sound of her voice, and for just a moment, its gaze lifted to meet hers, steady and calm, as though it understood far more than any ordinary animal reasonably should. Then it settled back down, resuming its quiet vigil by the fire, leaving Illyra with nothing but questions, and an exhaustion so complete that sleep finally claimed her, before she could think of anything else at all. Outside her door, in a corridor lit only by flickering torchlight, King Roderick Ashvane stood alone for a long while, staring at nothing in particular, his mind turning over the events of the evening again and again. In all his years on the throne, he had never once seen Ash defy a direct command. Not during the darkest days following his father's poisoning, not during the tense negotiations with rival houses that had nearly plunged the kingdom into open conflict. Never, until tonight, when a frozen, exhausted stranger had walked out of his most dangerous forest, carrying a box that seemed to matter more to his own wolf than his explicit orders. He did not yet know what to make of it, but he intended to find out, and he intended to do so before the box, and whatever secrets it held, had a chance to unravel anything further within the fragile peace his kingdom had only just begun to rebuild. Morning arrived pale and quiet, sunlight filtering weakly through the frost-covered window of Illyra's room in the west tower. She woke slowly, disoriented for a moment by the unfamiliar surroundings, before the events of the previous night came flooding back to her all at once. She sat up quickly, relieved to find Ash still curled by the now dying embers of the hearth, its golden eyes opening lazily to meet hers as she stirred. A soft knock came at the door moments later, and Garrick entered, carrying a tray of warm bread, cheese, and a steaming cup of something that smelled faintly of honey and herbs. "Good morning," he said, setting the tray down on a small table near the window. "I trust you slept well, given the circumstances." "Better than I expected," Illyra admitted, accepting the offered food gratefully. Her body still ached from the journey, but a night of rest and warmth had done wonders for her exhausted mind. "Has His Majesty decided what to do with me?" Garrick's expression grew thoughtful. "He spent most of the night examining the box himself, alongside our most trusted scholars. I imagine he will want to speak with you again once he is finished. In the meantime, I would encourage you to eat and rest as much as you can. Whatever comes next, you will need your strength for it." Illyra ate slowly, her mind racing with questions she doubted anyone could fully answer. What had the scholars found within the box? Had they discovered anything that might explain her grandmother's urgent, desperate insistence that it reach the king before winter's first full moon? She glanced toward Ash, who had risen and stretched lazily, before settling near her feet, seemingly unconcerned by the uncertainty that filled the room. She did not have to wait long for answers. Within the hour, a guard arrived to escort her once again through the palace corridors, this time toward a smaller, more private chamber than the grand receiving hall she had stood in the night before. Ash followed closely at her side, as it had done since the moment they first crossed paths in the frozen forest. The chamber she entered was warm and intimate, dominated by a large wooden table covered in scattered papers and old, weathered documents. King Roderick stood near the table, his expression unreadable, though the dark circles beneath his eyes suggested he had gotten little sleep the previous night. Garrick stood beside him, along with an elderly woman Elira did not recognize, dressed in the robes of a court scholar. And there, resting in the center of the table, sat the small wooden box, its seal now broken, its lid open. "Please, sit," Roderick said, gesturing toward a chair across from him. His voice carried none of the sharp suspicion from the night before, though it remained carefully guarded, as though he had not yet decided how to feel about whatever had been discovered. Elira sat cautiously, her eyes drawn immediately to the box and its contents, now laid out carefully across the table. A folded letter, its parchment yellowed with age. A small silver pendant, shaped like a wolf's head, its craftsmanship intricate and clearly old. And beneath these, a worn, leather-bound journal that looked as though it had been read and reread countless times over many years. "My scholars spent the night examining everything within this box," Roderick said, his eyes moving between Elira and the objects on the table. "What they found has raised more questions than answers, and I believe you deserve to hear what we have learned, given everything you risked to bring it here." The elderly scholar stepped forward, lifting the folded letter with careful, practiced hands. "This letter," she said, "was written by a healer named Marta, addressed to the crown, dated some 30 years past. In it, she describes tending to a grievously poisoned patient in secret, using knowledge of rare herbs that few outside her own family possessed. She writes that she saved this patient's life, though she asked for nothing in return, beyond his solemn promise never to reveal her identity or her role in the matter, fearing retribution from whoever had poisoned him in the first place." Elira felt her breath catch in her chest. "Marta," she whispered. "Oh, that was my grandmother's name." Roderick's eyes fixed on her with sudden sharp intensity. "Your grandmother's letter," he said slowly, "describes saving the life of my father, King Aldrich, following the very poisoning attempt that shaped this entire kingdom's history for the past 3 decades. The room fell into a heavy, stunned silence. Elira stared at the letter, at the familiar, careful handwriting she recognized instantly, from years of watching her grandmother record notes on herbs and remedies in the margins of old books she had never known. In all her years growing up in that quiet cottage, her grandmother had never once mentioned saving a king's life, had never spoken of any connection to the very kingdom Elira now found herself standing within. "There's more," Garrick said gently, gesturing toward the silver pendant resting on the table. This wolf pendant was a personal token belonging to King Aldrich himself, one he was known to carry always, a gift from his own mother. According to the letter, he pressed it into Marta's hands as a token of his gratitude and his promise, telling her that should she or her family ever need his protection, they need only present this pendant, and it would be honored without question. Elira reached out slowly, her fingers trembling as she lifted the small silver pendant and turned it over in her hand. It was beautifully crafted, the wolf's head rendered with remarkable detail, its eyes set with tiny flecks of gold that caught the light. She had never seen it before in her life, and yet holding it now, she felt an unexpected weight settle over her, a sense of connection to a history she had never known existed. "Why would she never tell me any of this?" Elira asked quietly, more to herself than to anyone else in the room. "Perhaps," the elderly scholar offered gently, "because the danger that forced her into secrecy never fully passed. Whoever poisoned King Aldrich was never conclusively identified. If your grandmother believed that threat still lingered, silence may have been the only way she knew to keep you safe." Roderick had remained quiet during this exchange, his gaze fixed on the journal that still sat unopened on the table, his expression carrying a weight that seemed far heavier than simple curiosity. Finally, he reached out and opened it carefully, revealing pages filled with the same careful handwriting as the letter, dense with notes, observations, and what appeared to be detailed records spanning many years. "This will take considerable time to read through fully," he said quietly. "But even a brief glance suggests your grandmother continued documenting things long after that first encounter with my father. Suspicions, observations about people within this very court. It seems she never stopped watching, even from a distance, even after all these years of silence." Alira felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the winter cold outside. "Do you think whoever poisoned your father is still here, still within this palace?" Roderick's jaw tightened, and for a long moment, he did not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to something quieter, more careful. "I do not know, but I intend to find out, and it seems your grandmother may have left behind exactly the kind of evidence that could finally help me do so." He looked up from the journal, meeting Alira's eyes directly for the first time since she had entered the chamber, his expression shifting into something she had not expected to see from him. Not suspicion, not cold calculation, something closer to genuine gratitude, tempered still by caution, but real nonetheless. "I owe you an apology," he said, the words seeming to cost him some effort, as though apologies did not come easily, to a man who had spent so many years guarding himself against every possible threat. "I treated you as a potential enemy when you arrived here, having risked your life to honor a debt owed to my own family. That was unjust of me, and I am sorry for it." Alira did not know quite how to respond to such an admission from a king who, only the night before, had ordered her taken away under guard. "You didn't know," she said finally. "None of us did. I still don't fully understand what any of this means." "Nor do I, entirely," Roderick admitted, "but I intend to find out, and I would ask, if you are willing, that you remain here while we do. Your grandmother's journal may hold answers that could finally resolve a mystery that has haunted this kingdom for 30 years. And given everything Ash has shown us about its instincts toward you, I suspect your role in this matter may not yet be finished." Alira glanced down at Ash, who had settled calmly at her feet throughout the entire exchange, its golden eyes drifting between her and the king with what almost looked like quiet satisfaction. Whatever strange instinct had guided that wolf to protect her from the very first moment they crossed paths in the frozen forest, it seemed increasingly clear that it had known, long before anyone else, that Alira's arrival at this palace would mean far more than a simple delivery. "I'll stay," she said finally, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. "My grandmother spent her whole life carrying this secret. I want to understand why." Roderick nodded slowly, something that might almost have been the beginning of respect settling into his careful expression. "Then let us begin," he said, "and may we both find the answers we are looking for." Over the following days, Alira found herself settling into a strange new rhythm within the palace walls, one she could never have imagined when she first set out from her small village, carrying nothing but a sealed box and her grandmother's final wish. She was given a proper chamber within the main wing of the palace, far more comfortable than the modest room in the West Tower, and though guards remained stationed nearby, their presence now felt more protective than restrictive. Each morning, she joined Roderick, Garrick, and the elderly scholar, whose name she learned was Old Beatrice, in the same private chamber where the box had first been opened. Together, they worked through her grandmother's journal page by page, deciphering years of careful, cryptic notes that spoke of suspicions never fully voiced, observations made from a careful distance, and fragments of a larger picture that seemed to grow more troubling with every page they uncovered. "Here," Old Beatrice said one morning, tapping a finger against a particular passage as Alira and Roderick leaned in to read it more closely. "Your grandmother writes of a nobleman who visited King Aldrich frequently in the months before the poisoning, a man she describes as unusually interested in the king's private schedule and personal habits. She does not name him directly, likely out of caution, but she describes his family crest in enough detail that we may be able to identify him." Roderick's expression darkened as he studied the passage. "A crest, bearing crossed silver blades over a black field," he read aloud slowly. "That belongs to House Vane." Garrick's brow furrowed with concern. "Lord Edmund Vane's family has held significant influence in this court for generations, Your Majesty. If your grandmother's suspicions point toward his lineage, we must proceed with extraordinary caution. Accusing a house of Vane's standing without solid proof could tear this court apart. Elira listened carefully, absorbing every detail, even as a knot of unease settled in her stomach. She had encountered Lord Edmund Vane only once since arriving at the palace, a brief meeting in one of the grand hallways where he had studied her with an expression of polite curiosity that had nonetheless left her feeling strangely watched. He was an older man, silver-haired and impeccably dressed, known throughout the court for his sharp wit and his considerable influence over trade agreements with neighboring kingdoms. "We proceed carefully," Roderick said finally, closing the journal gently. "No accusations. No confrontations. Not until we have gathered enough evidence to be certain. I will not risk destabilizing this court based on suspicions written 30 years ago by a woman who, however trustworthy her intentions, may have been mistaken." "And if she wasn't mistaken?" Elira asked quietly. Roderick's eyes met hers, something grim and determined settling into his expression. "Then we will finally have the answers this kingdom has been denied for far too long." As the days passed, Elira found herself growing increasingly comfortable in Roderick's presence, a shift that surprised her more than she cared to admit. The cold, suspicious king who had nearly ordered her, dragged away on her first night in the palace, had given way to someone far more thoughtful, someone who listened carefully to her observations and treated her opinions with a respect she had not expected from a ruler of his standing. "You have a sharp mind," he told her one afternoon, as they sat together poring over another section of her grandmother's journal. "Most people in my position would have dismissed your suggestions by now. You are not trained in matters of court politics, and yet your instincts have proven sound more than once already." Elira felt a flush of pride at his words, quickly followed by an unexpected warmth she was not entirely sure how to interpret. "I grew up watching my grandmother solve problems most people considered impossible," she said. "She taught me to look carefully at things before deciding what they meant. I suppose some of that stayed with me." "A valuable lesson," Roderick said, "and one this court could benefit from more often. Too many here see only what they wish to see, or what benefits them most to believe." Ash, who had taken to spending nearly every waking moment near Elira since her arrival, let out a low, contented sound from where it lay curled near the hearth, as though offering its own quiet agreement with the sentiment. Roderick glanced toward his bonded wolf with something like fond exasperation. "It has never behaved this way toward anyone else," he admitted. "Not even toward me, in truth. Not with this particular kind of ease. Ash has always been loyal, but never quite this relaxed." "Maybe it simply likes me," Elira offered with a small smile, the first genuine moment of lightness she had allowed herself since arriving at the palace. "Perhaps," Roderick said, though something in his tone suggested he suspected there was more to it than simple preference, a mystery he had not yet fully unraveled, but seemed increasingly willing to accept without demanding immediate answers. Not everyone within the palace shared the king's growing warmth toward the unexpected visitor from Hollow Creek, however. In a private study several corridors away, Lord Edmund Vane sat alone at his desk, a cup of wine untouched before him, his sharp eyes fixed on nothing in particular, as his mind turned over troubling reports that had reached him over the past several days. A girl had arrived at the palace gates, escorted by the king's own wolf, carrying a box that had reportedly thrown the entire court into quiet turmoil. Whispers had already begun circulating among the servants, rumors of old journals and long-buried secrets, finally coming to light after 30 years of careful silence. Edmund had spent decades ensuring that certain truths remained buried, and the sudden, unexpected arrival of this girl threatened to unravel work he had considered permanently secure. He rose from his desk and moved toward the window, staring out over the snow-covered courtyard below, his expression carefully composed, despite the tension coiling tightly in his chest. He had survived 30 years of careful maneuvering within this court, 30 years of ensuring that no one ever looked too closely at the events surrounding King Aldrich's near assassination. He did not intend to see that careful work undone now, not by a girl from some forgotten village, and certainly not by a journal written by a healer he had believed long forgotten by history. A soft knock came at his study door, and a young man entered, dressed in the plain clothing of a palace servant, though his eyes carried a wariness that suggested he served purposes beyond simple household duties. "My lord," he said quietly, closing the door behind him. "You wish to see me." "I need information," Edmund said, turning from the window to face him. "The girl staying in the eastern wing, the one who arrived with the wolf. I want to know everything about her. Where she came from, what she knows, and most importantly, what exactly was contained in that box she delivered to the king." The young man nodded, though something in his expression suggested unease at the request. "That may prove difficult, my lord. The king has kept the matter closely guarded. Very few beyond his most trusted advisors have been permitted near it." "Then find another way," Edmund said, his voice sharpening with an edge of impatience he rarely allowed himself to display. "I have not survived 30 years in this court through carelessness, and I do not intend to let some peasant girl and a dead healer's forgotten scribblings threaten everything I have built. Do you understand me?" The young man swallowed and nodded quickly. "Yes, my lord. I will see what I can learn." After the servant departed, Edmund remained standing at his window for a long while, watching the snow fall gently over the palace grounds below, his mind already turning over possibilities, contingencies, and the various careful steps that might yet be necessary to protect the secret he had guarded so carefully for so many years. Whatever this journal contained, whatever suspicions a long-dead healer had recorded within its pages, Edmund Vane had every intention of ensuring it never saw the light of full disclosure. He had come too far, sacrificed too much, and built too much influence within this court to allow a chance arrival from some distant village to unravel it all now. The girl, he decided, would need to be watched closely, and if watching alone proved insufficient to protect his secrets, he was prepared to consider other, more decisive measures, whatever those might eventually require. 3 nights after Lord Edmund Vane's conversation with his servant, Elira woke suddenly in the darkness of her chamber, her heart pounding for reasons she could not immediately identify. The room was quiet, the fire in the hearth reduced to softly glowing embers, and moonlight spilled pale and silver through the frost-covered window. Beside her bed, Ash had risen from its usual resting place, its body tense, its ears pricked forward, its golden eyes fixed intently on the door. "What is it?" Elira whispered, sitting up slowly, every instinct telling her something was wrong. The wolf did not answer, of course, but it moved silently toward the door, a low growl building deep in its chest, barely audible but unmistakable. Elira slipped out of bed, pulling a shawl around her shoulders, and crept toward the door as well, straining to hear anything beyond the usual quiet of the sleeping palace. There it was. Footsteps, soft and careful, moving along the corridor outside her room, pausing occasionally as though someone were checking each door they passed. Elira's breath caught in her throat. The guards stationed outside her chamber should have prevented anyone from approaching unannounced, and yet the footsteps continued, drawing closer with every passing moment. Ash's growl deepened, and before Elira could decide what to do, the wolf lunged toward the door, letting out a sharp, ferocious bark that shattered the quiet of the corridor entirely. Elira heard a startled gasp from just beyond her door, followed immediately by the guards' voices raised in sudden alarm, and the unmistakable sound of someone running. She threw open her door just in time to see one of the guards chasing a shadowy figure down the corridor, while the other guard remained behind, his expression tense as he turned to check on her. "Are you unharmed, my lady?" he asked quickly, using a title she had not yet grown accustomed to hearing applied to herself. "I'm fine," Elira said, her heart still racing. "What happened? Who was that?" "We're not certain yet," the guard admitted, glancing anxiously down the corridor, where his companion had disappeared in pursuit. Whoever it was moved quickly, and clearly knew how to avoid the usual patrols. "If your wolf hadn't raised the alarm when it did, I fear they might have reached your chamber unnoticed." Word of the incident reached King Roderick within minutes, and he arrived at her chamber still dressed in the simple clothing he had apparently been wearing when the alarm was raised, his expression tight with concern that he made no effort to hide. "Are you certain you are unharmed?" he asked, his eyes moving over her with a careful, searching quality that made Elira's chest tighten with an emotion she was not quite ready to examine too closely. "I'm fine," she assured him again. Ash heard them before they even reached the door. Roderick's gaze shifted toward the wolf, who had returned to its position at Elira's side, though its posture remained alert, its golden eyes still watchful, despite the apparent departure of whatever threat had prompted its earlier warning. "It seems I owe my wolf yet another debt of gratitude," he murmured, though the tension in his voice suggested his mind was already turning toward far more troubling considerations. The guard who had given chase returned a short while later, his expression grim, empty-handed despite his best efforts. The intruder escaped through the servants' passage near the eastern stairwell, Your Majesty, he reported. Whoever it was clearly knew the palace layout well enough to navigate it even in darkness. I found no trace of them beyond the outer gardens. Roderick's jaw tightened, and Alira could see the careful calculations already forming behind his eyes. This was no random intrusion, he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else in the room. Someone within this palace, or someone with intimate knowledge of it, wanted access to something in this chamber badly enough to risk being caught. The journal, Alira realized suddenly, her stomach dropping with sudden understanding. They must have been after my grandmother's journal. Roderick's expression confirmed her suspicion even before he spoke. It would explain a great deal, he said grimly. Someone within this court has grown concerned enough about what that journal might reveal to attempt something this reckless. Which suggests, unfortunately, that your grandmother's suspicions may have been correct after all. The following morning, Roderick ordered the journal moved to a more secure location within his own private study, guarded around the clock by soldiers he trusted absolutely. He also assigned additional guards to Alira's chamber, along with strict instructions that no one, regardless of rank or standing within the court, was to be granted access to her without his explicit personal approval. I should have anticipated this sooner, he admitted to her later that day, as they sat together once again in the private chamber, where they had spent so many hours working through her grandmother's careful, cryptic notes. Whoever betrayed my father 30 years ago has clearly maintained enough influence within this court to learn of your arrival and grow concerned about what you might have brought with you. I was foolish not to consider that they might attempt something this direct. You couldn't have known, Alira said gently, surprising herself with how naturally the reassurance came to her. In the days since her arrival, she had grown steadily more comfortable in Roderick's presence. The careful distance between a king and a stranger from a distant village, gradually softening into something that felt increasingly like genuine friendship, tentative but real. Roderick looked at her for a long moment, something complicated passing behind his careful eyes. You have an unusual way of offering comfort, he said finally, particularly towards someone who very nearly had you thrown into a dungeon on the night we first met. Alira felt a small smile tug at her lips despite the tension of recent events. You were protecting your kingdom, she said. I understand that better now than I did that first night. You didn't know what I was carrying, or whether I could be trusted. I suppose I can't fault you too much for caution, given everything you've clearly endured. Most people in your position would still hold that against me, Roderick observed quietly. Most people didn't grow up watching a grandmother who kept secrets for 30 years to protect the people she loved, Alira replied. I understand caution better than you might expect. Something shifted subtly in Roderick's expression at her words, a warmth entering his careful gaze that had not been there during their earlier, more guarded exchanges. Before either of them could examine that shift too closely, however, Garrick entered the chamber, his expression carrying the particular urgency that Alira had learned, over the past several days, usually accompanied important news. Your Majesty, he said, we may have identified the servant responsible for last night's intrusion. One of the kitchen staff reported seeing a young man matching the guard's description, leaving through the servants' gate shortly before dawn, moving with unusual haste, and carrying a bag that appeared far heavier than his usual duties would require. Do we know where he went? Roderick asked, rising immediately from his seat. Not yet, Your Majesty, though we have men searching the surrounding districts already. More importantly, however, we managed to identify which household he served, before joining the palace kitchen staff 3 months ago. Garrick paused, his expression grave. Records indicate he was previously employed within Lord Edmund Vane's household. The chamber fell into a heavy, weighted silence. Alira watched as Roderick's expression hardened into something far more serious than the careful suspicion he had displayed toward her during their first encounter, a coldness settling over his features that spoke of a king finally beginning to see, with growing clarity, exactly where the threads of this 30-year-old mystery might ultimately lead. Say nothing of this to anyone beyond this room, Roderick said finally, his voice low and controlled despite the evident tension coiled beneath it. If Lord Vane is indeed connected to what happened last night, we cannot afford to alert him that we suspect his involvement. Not until we have gathered enough proof to act with absolute certainty. Alira felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the winter cold pressing against the chamber's windows. Whatever her grandmother had witnessed 30 years ago, whatever careful, cryptic suspicions she had recorded in that worn leather journal. It seemed increasingly clear that the danger she had once feared, enough to maintain decades of silence, had never truly disappeared at all. It had simply been waiting, patient and hidden, within the very walls of the palace where Alira now found herself standing at the center of a mystery, far larger and far more dangerous than she could ever have imagined when she first set out from Hollow Creek, carrying nothing but a sealed box and a promise to a dying woman she had loved more than anyone else in the world. In the days that followed, the palace settled into an uneasy quiet, though beneath its calm surface, a careful investigation continued to unfold. Roderick assigned trusted soldiers to monitor Lord Edmund Vane's movements discreetly, while he, Alira, Garrick, and old Beatrice devoted themselves to searching through decades of old palace records, searching for any additional evidence that might confirm or dispel the growing suspicion that had settled over all of them since the failed intrusion into Alira's chamber. "Here," Garrick said one afternoon, his voice carrying an edge of quiet excitement as he pulled a weathered ledger from a tall shelf within the palace archives, a vast room filled with towering shelves of records stretching back generations. Guest registries from the month before King Aldrich's poisoning. If your grandmother's suspicions about House Vane hold any truth, we may find something useful here. Alira watched as Garrick carefully turned the brittle pages, scanning row after row of carefully recorded names, dates, and purposes of visit. The archive room was cold and dimly lit, illuminated only by a handful of oil lamps that cast long, flickering shadows across the towering shelves surrounding them. She had spent countless hours here over the past several days, and though the work was tedious, she found a strange comfort in it, a sense of purpose that had steadied her through the uncertainty of everything else happening around her. "There," Garrick said finally, tapping a finger against a particular entry. "Edmund Vane, recorded as visiting the palace 7 times in the 6 weeks preceding the poisoning, far more frequent than his usual attendance at court, according to earlier records." Roderick, who had been examining a separate stack of documents nearby, moved closer to study the entry himself, his expression darkening as he read it. 7 visits in 6 weeks, he murmured, and each one recorded as a private audience with my father, according to this notation here. "It's not proof of anything conclusive," old Beatrice cautioned gently, looking up from her own work at a nearby table. "Many nobles sought private audiences with the king regularly during that period. Trade negotiations, territorial disputes, matters of court politics. Frequent visits alone do not confirm involvement in something as serious as attempted assassination." "No," Roderick agreed, though his tone carried little genuine reassurance. "But combined with Marta's journal entries describing a nobleman bearing House Vane's crest, showing unusual interest in my father's private schedule, and now this servant's connection to Edmund's own household attempting to steal that very journal, the pattern grows increasingly difficult to dismiss as mere coincidence." Alira, who had been quietly reviewing a separate collection of old correspondence, suddenly paused, her attention caught by a particular letter tucked between several unrelated documents. "Wait," she said, drawing the other's attention. "This letter is addressed to Lord Edmund Vane, dated just 2 weeks before King Aldrich's poisoning. It appears to have been misfiled among unrelated correspondence." Roderick crossed the room quickly, taking the letter from her hands and reading it carefully, his expression growing increasingly troubled with every line. "This references a debt," he said slowly. "A debt owed by Edmund Vane to someone identified only as our mutual associate, with a warning that failure to resolve the matter before the season's end would result in consequences neither party could afford." "A debt," Garrick repeated thoughtfully. "Financial pressure has driven noblemen to far worse actions than betrayal before, Your Majesty. If Edmund found himself desperate enough, and someone offered him a way to resolve that debt in exchange for information about your father's movements and habits, it would explain everything," Roderick finished quietly, his voice carrying a controlled anger that Alira had not heard from him before. Not simple ambition, but desperation, manipulated by someone else entirely, someone who used Edmund's financial troubles to gain access to my father through him. "Then Edmund may not have been the mastermind at all," Alira said slowly, piecing together the implications as she spoke. "Just someone who was used, the same way that servant you captured decades ago was likely used as well." "Perhaps," Roderick said, though his expression remained hard, unforgiving. "But used or not, If he provided the access that nearly cost my father his life, and has spent 30 years helping ensure the truth remained buried, he bears responsibility regardless of who ultimately orchestrated the plot itself. And if there truly is another party involved, someone who has remained hidden and unaccountable for 3 decades, I intend to find them as well. The implications of this discovery settled heavily over the room, and for a long moment, no one spoke. Illyra found herself watching Roderick carefully, noting the way his hands had curled into tight fists at his sides, the tension radiating from every line of his posture. She understood, perhaps better than anyone else in that room, the particular weight of finally confronting a truth that had remained hidden for far too long. "What will you do?" she asked quietly. Roderick was silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on the old letter still clutched in his hand. "I will not act rashly," he said finally. 30 years of careful silence will not be undone by careless haste now. We need more proof, enough to be absolutely certain, before I move against a house as influential as Vane's. An accusation without sufficient evidence could tear this court apart, and worse, could allow whoever truly orchestrated my father's poisoning to simply retreat further into the shadows, safe behind Edmund's willingness to serve as a convenient scapegoat. "So we keep searching," Garrick said, already turning back toward the towering shelves surrounding them. "We keep searching," Roderick confirmed, "and we do so quietly, carefully, until we have gathered enough to act with absolute certainty." As the afternoon wore on, Illyra found her thoughts drifting, despite her best efforts to remain focused on the tedious work of sifting through old records. She thought of her grandmother again, of the quiet, careful woman who had spent decades tending to sick villagers while carrying secrets far heavier than anyone around her had ever suspected. She wondered how much her grandmother had truly known, how many nights she must have spent worrying over a truth she felt powerless to fully expose, protecting instead the family she had built in that small, quiet cottage at the edge of Hollow Creek. "Your grandmother was remarkably brave," Roderick said quietly, seeming to sense the direction of her thoughts as they worked side by side at the long table. To carry this kind of knowledge for 30 years, knowing the danger it represented, and still find the strength to raise a family, and build a quiet, peaceful life despite it. That takes a particular kind of courage. She never seemed burdened by it, Illyra said softly. Not that I ever noticed, at least. She was always so calm, so steady. I never once suspected she was carrying something like this. Perhaps that steadiness was its own form of strength, Roderick offered. Some people carry their heaviest burdens quietly, precisely so the people they love never have to feel their weight. Illyra looked up at him, struck by the unexpected gentleness in his observation, so different from the cold, suspicious king who had greeted her on that first terrifying night in the receiving hall. In the days since her arrival, she had watched him gradually reveal layers of thoughtfulness and quiet compassion that the stories she had heard on her journey here had never once mentioned, buried beneath years of necessary caution and the weight of ruling a kingdom still healing from old wounds. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for taking this seriously, for believing that my grandmother's journal was worth pursuing, even though it's put your own court in such a difficult position." "You have Ash to thank for that, at least in part," Roderick said, glancing toward the wolf, who had settled comfortably near the archive room's entrance, its golden eyes drifting lazily between the shelves and its 2 favorite companions. "Though I confess, even before its rather dramatic intervention on your first night here, something about your honesty struck me as genuine. I have grown skilled, out of necessity, at recognizing deception. You never once displayed it." Their eyes met for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them that neither seemed quite ready to name directly. Garrick, noticing the pause, cleared his throat gently from across the room, drawing their attention back toward the mountain of records still waiting to be examined. "If we hope to gather sufficient proof before Lord Vane grows suspicious of our inquiries," he said, "I suggest we return to work. 30 years of carefully buried secrets rarely surrender themselves easily, even under the most determined scrutiny." Roderick nodded, though Illyra noticed the faint smile that lingered at the corner of his mouth as he turned back toward the documents before him, a small, private acknowledgement of the moment they had just shared before duty reclaimed his full attention once more. Outside the archive room's narrow windows, snow continued falling steadily over the palace grounds, and somewhere within those same walls, Lord Edmund Vane remained entirely unaware of just how close the careful, patient investigation had already drawn to uncovering the truth he had spent 30 years working so desperately to keep buried. Lord Edmund Vane had not survived 30 years within the treacherous currents of court politics without developing a keen instinct for danger, and in recent days, that instinct had begun sounding a persistent, unwelcome alarm within him. He had noticed the subtle shift in how certain guards regarded him, the careful way conversations seemed to pause slightly whenever he entered a room, the increasing frequency with which Garrick and the king retreated to private discussions that excluded him entirely from matters he had once been trusted to advise on. He sat alone in his private study once more, the same young servant who had failed to retrieve the journal standing nervously before his desk, having narrowly avoided capture during his hasty retreat several nights earlier. "You were fortunate," Edmund said coldly, his fingers drumming against the polished wood of his desk. "Fortunate that Wolf did not catch you before you reached the servants' gate. Fortunate the guards were slow enough in their pursuit to lose you in the gardens. I do not appreciate relying on fortune, and I am now forced to wonder whether your incompetence has drawn more attention toward me than the information you failed to retrieve would ever have been worth." "I'm sorry, my lord," the servant stammered. "I did not expect the wolf to be inside the chamber itself. I thought—" "You thought incorrectly," Edmund snapped, cutting him off sharply. "And now I must consider what steps remain available to protect myself, given your failure." He rose from his desk and moved toward the window, staring out over the snow-covered gardens below, his mind working through the increasingly limited options remaining to him. The journal itself had already been moved beyond his reach, secured now within the king's own private study. Under guard he had no realistic hope of circumventing. But the girl, the source of this entire unwelcome disruption to 30 years of careful silence, remained a variable he might still be able to influence. If he could not retrieve the journal, perhaps he could instead discredit the messenger who had delivered it, a girl from an obscure village, with no allies within the court, no family connections to protect her, no standing beyond the king's own growing and increasingly suspicious favor. If he could plant sufficient doubt about her intentions, suggest that she herself posed some manner of threat to the crown, he might yet be able to redirect attention away from himself entirely. "I have a new task for you," Edmund said, turning back toward his nervous servant. "One that will require considerably more care than your previous attempt." Over the following days, Edmund began carefully cultivating rumors throughout the court, subtle whispers suggesting that the girl who had arrived with such dramatic circumstances might not be entirely what she claimed. He suggested, in carefully measured conversations with other nobles, that a peasant girl, arriving unannounced with a mysterious box and an unprecedented ability to command the king's own wolf, seemed, upon reflection, rather too convenient a circumstance to accept without deeper scrutiny. Perhaps, he suggested delicately, she was working for some rival kingdom, using elaborate deception to gain the king's trust for purposes not yet revealed. The rumors spread slowly at first, then with gathering momentum, as they so often did within a court already primed toward suspicion by decades of unresolved uncertainty surrounding King Aldrich's near assassination. Illyra began noticing the shift herself within days, the careful, guarded glances from nobles she passed in the corridors, the way conversations seemed to quiet slightly whenever she entered certain rooms. "You've heard the rumors," Roderick said one evening, finding her in the palace gardens where she had retreated to escape the mounting tension she felt building around her. Snow had stopped falling for the first time in days, and the gardens, though bare and frost-covered, held a quiet, peaceful beauty beneath the pale evening sky. "I've heard them," Illyra admitted. "People think I'm some kind of spy, sent to manipulate you and Ash for purposes I haven't revealed." "The rumors are baseless," Roderick said firmly, "and I suspect I know exactly where they originated." "Lord Vane," Illyra said, and Roderick nodded grimly. "He grows desperate," Roderick observed, "which suggests our investigation has drawn closer to the truth than he finds comfortable. Desperate men make mistakes, Illyra. I intend for us to be ready when he makes his." That readiness was tested sooner than either of them expected. 3 nights later, Illyra woke once again to Ash's low, warning growl, though this time, the wolf's attention was fixed not on her chamber door, but on the window overlooking the palace gardens below. She rose quickly, moving to the window, and felt her stomach drop as she saw a flickering torchlight moving through the gardens, accompanied by raised voices carrying faintly on the cold night air. She dressed hurriedly, and made her way toward the source of the commotion, Ash padding silently beside her, only to find a small crowd already gathered near the garden's central fountain, where two guards stood over a captured figure struggling weakly against their firm grip. As she drew closer, her breath caught in recognition. It was the same young servant who had attempted to steal her grandmother's journal days earlier. "What's happening?" she asked, approaching Garrick, who stood nearby, overseeing the scene with a grim expression. "He was caught attempting to plant something within your chamber," Garrick explained quietly, drawing her slightly aside from the gathered crowd. "A guard noticed him approaching your window from the garden side, carrying what appears to be a small pouch of foreign coin, likely intended to be discovered among your belongings as false evidence of outside payment for espionage." Alira felt cold dread settle over her, despite the relative warmth of her cloak. "They were trying to frame me," she realized. "It appears so," Garrick confirmed. "Fortunately, the increased guard presence around your chamber, ordered by His Majesty following the previous incident, proved sufficient to catch him before he could complete whatever he intended." Roderick arrived moments later, his expression carrying a controlled fury that Alira had not seen from him since their very first encounter in the receiving hall, though this time, that anger was directed entirely elsewhere. He approached the captured servant directly, his voice low and dangerous, in a way that made even the surrounding guards straighten with sudden attention. "You will tell me everything," Roderick said. "Who sent you, what you intended, and why. Cooperation now may yet earn you some measure of mercy. Continued silence will not." The young servant, clearly terrified and already exhausted from his failed attempts to evade capture, broke quickly under the weight of the king's stern, unwavering attention. "Lord Vane," he stammered. "He instructed me to plant the coin purse, said it would be found during a routine search, and would prove the girl had been receiving payment from a rival kingdom. He wanted her discredited, wanted suspicion turned away from himself and onto her instead." A heavy silence fell over the gathered crowd as this confession settled over everyone present. Roderick's expression grew colder still, though when he finally spoke, his voice remained carefully controlled, betraying none of the deeper anger Alira suspected was building beneath his composed exterior. "Take him to secure holding," he instructed the guards. "He is to be questioned further, thoroughly, and treated with appropriate care in the process. I want a full account of everything Lord Vane has instructed him to do, dating back to his very first day within this household." As the guards led the trembling servant away, Roderick turned toward Alira, his expression softening slightly as he took in her pale, shaken appearance. "Are you unharmed?" he asked, the same question he had posed following the first intrusion, though this time, carrying an additional weight of genuine concern that Alira did not miss. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice trembled slightly, despite her best efforts to steady it. "He never even reached my window. Thanks to Ash's warning, and thanks to guards who took their duties seriously," Roderick said. "But this confirms what we suspected. Lord Vane has grown desperate enough to attempt discrediting you directly, which tells me he understands, perhaps even better than we do ourselves, just how close this investigation has drawn to exposing the truth he has spent 30 years protecting." "What happens now?" Alira asked. Roderick's expression hardened with renewed determination. "Now," he said, "we have a confession implicating Lord Vane directly in a plot against you, combined with the mounting evidence we've already gathered connecting him to my father's poisoning 3 decades ago. It is enough, I believe, to finally move against him openly. Tomorrow, Lord Edmund Vane will answer for everything he has done, both 30 years ago and this very week." Ash, sensing the shift in tension surrounding them, moved closer to Alira's side, its golden eyes reflecting the flickering torchlight scattered throughout the garden. Whatever danger had followed her since her arrival at this palace, whatever careful, patient scheme Lord Vane had constructed to protect his decades-old secret, it seemed increasingly clear that the wolf's earliest instincts about her had been proven correct once again. She had never been the threat this court needed to fear. She had simply been the key that would finally unlock a truth 30 years overdue. The following morning, the grand receiving hall filled with members of the court, summoned by the king's own command, to witness proceedings that had been kept carefully quiet until this very moment. Alira stood near the edge of the raised platform, close enough to observe everything unfolding, though not so close as to draw unnecessary attention from the assembled nobles, whose curious, uncertain murmurs filled the vast stone chamber as they awaited the king's explanation for such an unusual gathering. Ash remained close at her side, as it had been every day since their first fateful encounter in the frozen forest, its golden eyes moving steadily across the crowd with the same watchful alertness that had already proven so valuable in recent days. King Roderick entered the hall with measured, deliberate steps, his expression carrying the particular calm of a man who had spent the entire night preparing carefully for what needed to happen next. Garrick walked beside him, along with several guards, and behind them, escorted firmly but without unnecessary roughness, walked Lord Edmund Vane himself, his usual composed confidence, replaced by a tightly controlled wariness that suggested he had already guessed, at least in part, what awaited him. The murmurs throughout the hall quieted quickly as Roderick ascended the platform and turned to address the assembled court, his voice carrying clearly across the vast chamber. 30 years ago, he began, my father, King Aldrich, was poisoned within these very walls by someone who was never conclusively identified. That uncertainty has haunted this court for 3 decades, shaping decisions, breeding suspicion, and preventing this kingdom from ever fully healing from that betrayal. I stand before you today because that uncertainty has finally, at long last, been resolved. A wave of stunned murmurs swept through the gathered nobles, and Alira watched as Lord Vane's expression tightened further, his eyes darting briefly toward her, before returning to fix on the king with careful, guarded attention. Evidence has come to light, Roderick continued, proving that Lord Edmund Vane provided crucial access and information that allowed my father's poisoning to succeed, motivated by a substantial debt he owed to an outside party, whose identity we continue to investigate. Furthermore, this same evidence proves that Lord Vane has spent the past 30 years working to ensure this truth remained buried, culminating just this past week in an attempt to discredit and frame an innocent guest of this court in order to protect himself from exposure. This is absurd, Edmund said sharply, though his voice lacked the full confidence it might once have carried. Baseless accusations, built on the ramblings of a dead healer and the coerced confession of a frightened servant. I have served this crown faithfully for 30 years, Your Majesty, and I deserve better than to be publicly humiliated based on such flimsy evidence. Flimsy evidence, Roderick repeated, his voice carrying a dangerous edge beneath its careful control. Perhaps you would care to explain, then, why guest registries from 30 years ago show 7 private audiences with my father in the 6 weeks preceding his poisoning, an unprecedented frequency compared to your usual attendance at court. Perhaps you would care to explain the letter referencing a substantial debt owed to an unnamed associate, dated just 2 weeks before that poisoning occurred. Or perhaps you would care to explain why your own household servant confessed, in considerable detail, to being instructed by you personally to plant false evidence against an innocent woman merely days ago. Edmund's composure finally began to crack, visibly under the weight of these accumulated details, his eyes darting around the hall as though searching for some escape from the mounting evidence arrayed against him. Whatever mistakes I may have made regarding recent events, he said carefully, I had no involvement whatsoever in your father's poisoning 30 years ago. I was young, ambitious, perhaps overly interested in currying favor through frequent visits, but I never— Then explain the debt, Roderick interrupted sharply. Explain who this mysterious associate was, and what precisely they required of you, in exchange for resolving whatever financial trouble you found yourself facing at that time. The hall fell into tense, expectant silence as every eye turned toward Lord Edmund Vane, waiting for his response. For a long moment, he said nothing at all, his jaw working silently, as though caught between competing instincts of self-preservation and some deeper, more complicated calculation Alira could not fully read from where she stood. Finally, his shoulders sagged slightly, the last of his careful composure finally giving way entirely. I did not orchestrate the poisoning, he said quietly, his voice carrying none of its earlier sharpness, but I provided the access that made it possible. I was deeply in debt at the time, facing ruin that would have destroyed my family's standing entirely, and a man approached me, offering to resolve that debt in exchange for detailed information about your father's private schedule. I did not know, I swear to you, what he intended to use that information for, not until it was already too late to undo what had been done. Who was this man? Roderick demanded, stepping closer to the platform's edge. Edmund hesitated once more, though the fight seemed to have gone out of him entirely now, replaced by a weary resignation that suggested he understood, finally, that continued denial served no further purpose. "I never learned his true name," he admitted. "He operated always through intermediaries, careful never to reveal himself directly. But he claimed connections to the Northern Territories, and given the timing of certain border disputes during that period, I have long suspected he may have been acting on behalf of interests, hoping to see your father's rule destabilized entirely, perhaps even hoping to see the crown itself thrown into chaos, and vulnerable to outside influence." Roderick absorbed this information with a controlled stillness that Alira had come to recognize as the mark of his deepest, most careful thinking. "You will provide every detail you can recall," he said finally. "Every meeting, every piece of correspondence, anything at all that might help us finally identify this individual, even after 30 years. Your cooperation in this matter will be considered when determining your ultimate punishment for the role you have already admitted to playing, both in my father's poisoning and in your recent actions against an innocent guest of this court." Edmund nodded slowly, the last vestiges of his once formidable pride finally giving way, entirely beneath the weight of 30 years of carefully guarded guilt, finally brought into the light. Guards moved to escort him from the hall, and as they did, Roderick turned to address the assembled court once more, his gaze sweeping across the gathered nobles with quiet, unmistakable authority. "Let this serve as a reminder," he said, "that truth, however long buried, has a way of finding the light eventually. And let it serve as well as a testament to the courage of one particular guest of this court, who risked her life crossing the Ashvane woods in the depths of winter, to honor a promise made to her dying grandmother, a promise that has finally allowed this kingdom to begin healing from a wound 30 years in the making." He gestured toward Alira, drawing the attention of the entire assembled court toward her, and she felt her cheeks flush with sudden, unexpected warmth beneath the weight of so many curious eyes. "Alira of Hollow Creek," Roderick continued, "granddaughter of the healer Marta, who once saved my father's life, and asked nothing in return beyond his promise of protection, a promise this crown intends to honor fully, both for her grandmother's sacrifice and for her own extraordinary courage in bringing this truth to light." A murmur of quiet approval moved through the assembled nobles, and Alira felt ash press gently against her leg, as though offering its own silent support amid the sudden, overwhelming attention, now focused entirely upon her. She caught Roderick's eyes across the hall, and the warmth she found there, so different from the cold suspicion of their very first encounter, settled something deep within her chest that she had not fully realized she had been searching for since the moment she first set out from her small village carrying nothing but a sealed box, and a promise she had been determined, against every obstacle, to keep. The investigation into the mysterious Northern associate would continue in the weeks ahead, a new thread of mystery still waiting to be fully unraveled. But for now, within the walls of a palace that had carried the weight of an unresolved betrayal for 30 long years, something had finally begun to shift toward healing, carried forward by the quiet courage of a girl who had never imagined, when she first accepted her grandmother's dying wish, just how far its consequences would ultimately reach. Winter loosened its grip on the kingdom slowly over the weeks that followed, the deep snow surrounding the palace gradually giving way to patches of thawing earth as the season turned toward spring. Alira remained within the palace throughout this time, her presence there no longer questioned by anyone within the court, her standing transformed entirely from the frightened, exhausted stranger who had once stumbled through the palace gates into someone the entire kingdom had come to regard with genuine respect and quiet admiration. The investigation into the mysterious figure from the Northern Territories continued steadily, though it would take considerably longer to fully resolve than the more immediate matter of Lord Vane's involvement had required. Roderick assigned trusted agents to pursue every lead Edmund had provided, and though answers came slowly, each small discovery brought the kingdom closer to finally understanding the full scope of what had happened 30 years earlier, and ensuring such a betrayal could never happen again. Lord Vane himself was stripped of his titles and holdings, his punishment tempered somewhat by his eventual cooperation, though he would spend the remainder of his years under careful watch, his once considerable influence within the court reduced to nothing. It was, Roderick had decided after careful consideration, a fitting resolution, neither excessively harsh nor undeservedly lenient, a judgment that reflected the complicated truth of a man who had made a desperate, foolish choice decades earlier, and had spent every year since trying, however wrongly, to protect himself from its consequences. For Alira, the weeks following that dramatic confrontation in the receiving hall brought changes she could never have anticipated when she first set out from Hollow Creek. She continued working alongside old Beatrice, discovering within herself an unexpected passion for the careful, detailed work of historical research, poring through old records and helping piece together fragments of the kingdom's complicated past, with the same patient attention her grandmother had once applied to her herbal remedies. She also found herself spending increasing amounts of time in Roderick's company, their working partnership gradually deepening into something neither of them had quite anticipated when they first met beneath such tense, uncertain circumstances. What had begun as suspicion and careful caution had grown, slowly and naturally, into a genuine friendship built on mutual respect and an increasingly comfortable familiarity that surprised them both. "You've changed since I first arrived here," Alira observed one afternoon, as they walked together through the palace gardens, where the first hesitant signs of spring had begun pushing through the thawing earth in small, hopeful patches of green. "Have I?" Roderick asked, though something in his tone suggested he already suspected the answer and was curious to hear her perspective regardless. "You smile more," Alira said simply. "That first night, I don't think I saw anything close to warmth in your expression at all. Now I catch it fairly often, even when you don't realize it." Roderick was quiet for a moment, considering her words carefully as they continued walking, Ash, trotting contentedly, a short distance ahead of them, occasionally pausing to investigate some interesting scent among the garden's thawing beds. "I spent a long time believing that caution and warmth could not coexist," he admitted finally. "That trusting too easily was precisely the kind of weakness that had allowed my father to be poisoned in the first place. I built walls around myself, Alira, thick enough that I stopped noticing when they had become more of a prison than a protection." "And now?" she asked gently. "Now," he said, "I have watched a girl walk through my most dangerous forest, face down my own suspicion and threats without ever wavering from her purpose, and ultimately help heal a wound this kingdom has carried for 30 years, all because she refused to abandon a promise made to someone she loved. It is difficult to maintain quite the same walls after witnessing something like that." Alira felt her cheeks warm, despite the cool spring air, though she found she did not mind the sensation nearly as much as she might have expected. "My grandmother always said that courage and caution could coexist," she said softly, "that the trick was simply knowing when each was needed, rather than choosing one and abandoning the other entirely." "Your grandmother," Roderick said, "sounds as though she was a remarkably wise woman." "She was," Alira agreed, a fond warmth settling over her at the thought of the woman who had raised her, who had carried such heavy secrets for so many years, while still finding room enough in her heart to build a peaceful, loving home. "I only wish I could tell her how everything turned out. I think she would be proud, even amid everything that's happened." "I believe she already knew," Roderick said quietly. "She trusted you with this task because she understood, better than perhaps even you did at the time, exactly what you were capable of. That trust was not misplaced, Alira, not in the slightest." They walked in comfortable silence for a while longer, the palace rising warm and golden behind them in the late afternoon light, its towers no longer carrying quite the same imposing, distant grandeur they had held on that first terrified night, when Alira had stumbled toward its gates, half frozen and utterly uncertain of what awaited her within. Ash returned from its exploration of the garden beds, settling itself comfortably between them, with the easy familiarity of a creature that had long since decided exactly where it belonged. Roderick reached down to scratch gently behind its ears, a gesture Alira had watched grow more natural and affectionate over the weeks since that first dramatic confrontation in the receiving hall. "I never did properly thank you," Roderick said, glancing toward his bonded wolf with quiet fondness. "For seeing something in her that I was too guarded to recognize myself, that first night." Ash simply huffed contentedly in response, leaning into his hand, seemingly entirely unbothered by the weight of everything its instincts had ultimately set into motion within the kingdom it called home. As spring continued its slow, steady arrival across the kingdom, life within the palace gradually settled into a new rhythm, one built on the foundation of truths finally brought into the light, and trust carefully, deliberately rebuilt between two people who had begun as wary strangers, and had grown, through hardship and shared purpose, into something far deeper and more meaningful than either had initially expected. Illyra thought often of her long walk through the frozen Ashvane woods, of the exhaustion and fear that had driven her forward, one difficult step at a time, carrying nothing but a sealed box, and a promise she had been determined to keep no matter the cost. She thought of her grandmother's final words, spoken with such quiet urgency in a cottage that had already begun to smell of endings, and she understood now, with a clarity she had not possessed during that desperate winter journey, exactly why those words had mattered so deeply. Her grandmother had carried a heavy truth for 30 long years, protecting it carefully, patiently, waiting for exactly the right moment to finally release it into the world. And in her final days, she had trusted her granddaughter, above anyone else, to carry that truth the rest of the way home. Illyra had done exactly that, through snow and fear and a king's suspicion, guided unexpectedly by a wolf whose instincts had recognized her worth before anyone else had thought to look closely enough to see it. And now, standing in a palace garden slowly awakening into spring, beside a king who had once tried to threaten her but whose own wolf had refused to let that threat stand, she understood at last that her grandmother's final wish had been fulfilled in every way that truly mattered. The kingdom was healing. The kingdom was healing. The truth had finally found its way into the light, and somewhere within the quiet, hopeful warmth of that spring garden, something new and lasting had begun to grow as well. Carried forward, not by fear or suspicion, but by trust freely given, and courage that had never once wavered, even when the road ahead had seemed impossibly uncertain. Ash settled contentedly between them, as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, casting the palace gardens in warm, golden light, and for the first time, in longer than he could clearly remember, King Roderick Ashvane allowed himself simply to feel at peace, grateful beyond measure, for the sealed box a stranger had once carried through the snow, and for everything that single, courageous journey had ultimately brought into his life.